Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is the 5th in a series of 4 reviews that I'm doing on Metal Gear Solid. If you've never watched these videos before, then I highly recommend watching the previous videos first, as this one picks up where those left off. This video contains full spoilers for Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, 3, 4 and Peace Walker. Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker was released in 2010 for the PlayStation Portable. Although it was released on a portable system which might tend to give the game a little less credibility, Peace Walker was originally referred to as Metal Gear Solid 5 within Kojima Productions, and had a development team rivaling that of MGS4. The game returns to the story of Big Boss as he builds up Militaire Sans Frontières, an army without a country. The game starts when Snake takes on a contract to find a missing girl amidst the middle of a CIA plot. Initially he seems apathetic to the whole thing, but a snippet of a cassette recording that sounds like the voice of the boss gets him to take the mission in order to figure out what's going on. Kaz Miller is Snake's support, his goal being to build MSF into a fully fledged business by taking on contracts from whoever needs their assistance, and this sets up the biggest change compared to other Metal Gear Solid games. Peace Walker is about stealth gameplay just like the other installments, but it's also about building up MSF into a sizable force. Much of the game is spent away from the jungle and in a menu, not unlike MGS3 I suppose, but this time the menus are a core part of the game in and of themselves. During missions, Snake can kidnap troops to send back to MSF in order to build up his force, very much like the previous portable MGS game Portable Ops, where Snake could also abduct soldiers and turn them to his side, but thankfully it's much more streamlined. In Portable Ops, players had to drag the soldiers back to a capture point, which quickly became a tedious exercise. In Peace Walker, the Fulton recovery system allows Snake to attach balloons to downed enemies in order to whisk them away. It's ridiculous obviously, but it serves a very important purpose by removing one of the worst elements of Portable Ops. Making the capture process easier allows players to really indulge themselves and go hunting for enemy troops non-stop. It's surprisingly addictive, and it's a nice way for the game to reward non-lethal combat methods. At this point I'm not sure I need to tell anyone the core gameplay is focused on stealth, same as all the previous installments, but there are a host of tweaks to the formula. This time around, camouflage plays a somewhat less important role as the player is incapable of changing camo on the fly. The crouch walking from MGS4 returns as the primary method of moving around, and the guard's senses seem to sit somewhere between the changes that occurred after MGS2. Most guard types are unlikely to spot Snake from long distance, but because the camo is less reliable, staying out of line of sight is definitely the best option. As such, it seems like a nice balance between the two very different types of stealth the series has had so far. The footage you're looking at now is from the re-release on the PS3. The graphical update isn't amazing, although the frame rate is consistently higher, which is nice. The main benefit of this version is the improved camera controls. Just like MGS3, which suffered from some camera troubles only to have them rectified in a later re-release, Peace Walker is better played with a second analog stick. The aiming on the PSP version uses the face buttons, which makes it rather clunky, especially in comparison to the other entries in the series where the first-person controls felt pretty well polished. The PSP version does have some advantages of its own. For example, it's obviously a lot easier to get a friend or two together in the same room doing multiplayer, but overall I'd say the re-release is the better option. The biggest downside to the re-release as far as I can see is the lack of rebalancing to account for the second analog stick. Enemies tend not to move around a lot, even in a firefight, probably because the aiming was originally more difficult to manage. As a result, it can feel quite easy playing the game with a controller, and unlike the other installments, Peace Walker lacks extra difficulty modes which might make up for this. I can understand why extra difficulty modes were excluded though, as this would have fractured the online community. Peace Walker's online modes were never going to be so popular for such a sustained amount of time that they could afford to frivolously split the community up any more than necessary. Although the difficulty can be a little disappointing when playing on a console, I still think it's the better option of the two because the controls just feel vastly more intuitive. Being released on the PSP prompted the team to go for a mission-based structure this time around. The focus is always on small objectives which can generally be achieved in 5 to 10 minutes. On a surface level, I can understand the logic behind this. Players on portable devices are less likely to be committed to several hours of playtime in one sitting, so a more fractured structure allows the objectives to be tackled in chunks. Or at least that's the theory. It's one a lot of handheld games subscribe to, shorter chunks of gameplay compared to their home console counterparts with breakpoints every 15 minutes or so. It makes more sense on a handheld than it does anywhere else, but I've never been convinced of the benefits of this. Say for example you're on a train and you decide to play some Peace Walker. You could start up a mission and finish it 10 minutes later. After that, your train might only have 5 minutes to go before reaching its destination. So what do? You have two main choices, keep playing or stop. If you keep playing, the next mission might only take a couple of minutes to finish, and you'd get even more time pretending to be Big Boss before arriving at your boring job. but alternatively it might take 10 minutes to finish the next mission instead, in which case you'd have to stop mid-mission. Either way, it's an imperfect solution. Either the game has failed to entertain you for the entire trip, or you've cut it off in the middle of a mission, which eliminates the need for that sort of format anyway. The PSP has a way to suspend gameplay and resume from the exact point it left off, which again undermines this sort of design. I think it's rare the mission format will ever perfectly match up with the amount of time a player has to invest, and I imagine many players are like myself in that they'll ignore it completely by just switching off whenever they feel like. This is also ignoring the fact that many players will simply play Peace Walker indoors and merely use their handhelds as a comfy way to play in bed or other parts of their home. I don't think it's a huge detriment to the game or anything, but I'm not convinced of the benefits either. One thing it does accomplish is bringing the player's attention to Mother Base, and it also gives an easy way to delineate how long each turn at Mother Base takes. Actions are completed as the player does missions, and pulling them out of the missions gives players a good chance to make the tweaks they'll need to make in order to get the base to flourish. Players are expected to manage various aspects of MSF which unlock over the course of the story. Initially, all there is to be done is assigning staff to one of the various tasks. This is perhaps the most important part of MSF, but it's also one of the most simple. Each potential crew member has a competency level in the relevant areas, but the way this is handled removes any sort of strategy or management from the process. Each soldier will generally excel in one field, like research and development. This means he's of the most benefit placed on the R&D team, which is where the auto-assign option will place him. Auto-assigning crew members is the best course of action for most of the game, and even without doing this, the choice is often clear just by looking at the stats. Much later on, once the player has completed the main game and is really just striving to make the best Mother Base possible, this can become an issue, but most of the time it's not worth thinking about. Even once the various departments become filled, the player can assign everyone back to the waiting room and use the auto-assign function again to weed out any weak recruits that are no longer needed. I think the reason it works this way is because they knew lots of players wouldn't be interested in managing MSF and simply wanted to complete missions as Snake. Therefore, they gave an easy way to skip over most of this stuff in a matter of seconds. Implementing MSF in this way kind of defeats the purpose though. Mother Base isn't as complicated as it should be to provide a satisfying management simulation, but it's also not automated completely for players who aren't interested. It's stuck somewhere in the middle. The way the stats on the soldiers work is probably the biggest problem, which could have done with a bit of tweaking, but the economy of Mother Base is also rather restrictive. Soldiers can go on outer ops or into the combat unit to generate money, but all of these funds funnel into the R&D team. There's no other way to spend them. As a result, there's no real way to specialise MSF how the player sees fit. And even within the R&D section, I found I was rarely forced to choose between one item or another since money is so plentiful. Since most, if not all, of the items unlocked by the R&D department are completely optional, it would have been great to see it split into a few main tech paths instead. For example, there could be a tech path for radars and one for goggles, with the best upgrades for each being visible at the end of the tree. If players were forced to spend research on either goggles or radar, then this would encourage more specialisation. Each area of the base is supposed to be performing optimally at all times, but I would have liked to see some trade-off here as well, and I think new spending options were probably necessary to make this happen. For example, players looking to do co-op could have been presented with an option to spend some money in order to attract other players to help them. Players could have been given control over the construction efforts, picking and choosing whether they want a new R&D lab or somewhere to store more vehicles, that kind of stuff. The menus are all fairly samey as well, just relying on lists to get the point across. The Metal Gear Zeke section is one of the better ones, since it shows changes to Zeke as they're made, but it still feels like scrolling through a disconnected set of options, the same as all the other menus. It might have been nice to place these options on Zeke itself. This probably would have been a tiny bit harder to navigate, but when players are going to be using a lot of menus, I think it's important to try and make those menus interesting in their own way to avoid fatigue. Similarly, the mission reports from Outer Ops aren't very inspired, and while it's initially a fun little feature to see the battles unfold, they quickly become tiresome because every battle has the same layout. This probably would have been more interesting with a little Soliton radar type view of the action. Nothing complicated, just some little dots on opposite sides of a vector style battlefield to help drive home the battle taking place. I understand, given the amount of stuff there is to do at Mother Base, that it would have been impossible to attach interesting graphics to everything, but as a result the choices here seem very detached from reality, which is a shame. Even though it has problems, I still really like the inclusion of MSF. It represents an interesting turn for the series, it doesn't feel out of place, and it's highly satisfying to see Mother Base grow gradually over the course of many hours of play. It's easy to while away time setting up squads, managing the troops, and looking over the little character blurbs. The pace at which this all unfolds is great as well. It's very evenly handed out over the course of the main story, and even after Chapter 4 is complete, the base may still have a lot of room to grow. It all ties into the multiplayer well, and although I have to admit the ability to trade troops seems of limited use since the base is so easy to manage, it's still a nice addition. The game has been built from the ground up to take advantage of the MSF premise with the inclusion of co-op multiplayer for the vast majority of missions. It works about as well as can be expected, although probably not as well as it ideally should. I never got a chance to play the online mode in Subsistence, but the one in MGS4 suffered from poor netcode or bad servers, maybe some combination of the two. Peace Walker feels a little better to me, but I also found it hard to shake the feeling that allies aren't always being kept properly in sync all the time. The focus was clearly on multiplayer within the same room for the PSP version, which to be fair does work flawlessly, and I found it to be a more satisfying experience than playing with random people across the globe. For the co-op mode, a bit of lag isn't a big issue, but it hampers the versus mode quite a lot. The competitive nature of things makes any problems a lot more frustrating. The included versus stuff feels fairly tacked on, and suffers from the low player counts. I thought the best mode of Metal Gear Online was Sneaking Mission, which is absent here because it wouldn't make sense with a small number of players. Players have a lot of choice when it comes to multiplayer shooters these days, and I don't think Peace Walker does enough different to stand out from the crowd in this regard. The co-op is well integrated though, and thankfully where most of the focus is. One small touch I really like is the way players can always see themselves as Snake if they choose him. If another player happens to be Snake as well, they're reskinned so they look like any other soldier. This keeps that nice illusion that the player is special and not merely a pawn in someone else's plans. The so-called main ops are where the story unfolds, and it can be surprisingly jarring how much the story takes a back seat in comparison to the other installments. The codec is hit the hardest, becoming nothing more than a tool for Snake to get simple one-line responses for advice. He's also incapable of using it to communicate back. To make up for this, there's a lot of briefing files the player can unlock later on in the story which flesh out some of the events, particularly those relating to the boss. I imagine this is another reaction to the portable nature of the game. It's unreasonable to expect a player to have time for a 10-minute codec conversation lodged into the middle of a mission if they're on the commute to work. So the briefing files sit in the menu and wait for the player to come to them first when they have free time. The codec is a shadow of its former self, but the graphic novel style cutscenes are used fairly heavily, probably even more than the cutscenes of MGS1. Ashley Wood's style, dating back to the interactive graphic novel release of MGS1, is still in use, and it looks as good as ever. These are largely used in place of the in-engine cutscenes of the other games, but they work well and lend the game a sort of grit and energy it would lack otherwise. Snake starts out on the hunt for more details about the boss, but quickly stumbles across the trail of some nuclear missiles and ends up tracking those down to learn the truth. Along the way he runs into Amanda and Chico, Resistance members who end up joining MSF. Their impact on the plot is ultimately negligible, but at least they function as special characters in MSF and give Snake a couple of people to talk to other than Miller. Thankfully, the dialogue seems to be a step up from MGS4, and I'd argue it's about as good as the script from MGS1. Characters talk to each other like human beings again most of the time. It's great to see them make little quips with one another and reveal their thoughts or intentions without reeling off a massive monologue. In particular, Snake is characterized very well. He seems down to earth, but also quite a bit more hardened than he was earlier in the timeline. He's tough, but fair. Maybe not as morally grey as he should be at this point in the chronology, but at least he's not overly heroic either. I'm not sure I'd call it a boss fight exactly, but one of the earliest confrontations pits Snake against some enemy soldiers along with a tank. It makes for a pretty sharp rise in difficulty. The guards have helmets on, which stop them from being taken out by a single headshot, which I otherwise think is a fantastic change, but introducing this at the same time as a tank mini-boss seems a bit excessive. This one can be taken out using entirely non-lethal methods, but this becomes difficult if not impossible to do on some of the later fights. There's an attempt here to balance the weapons so that players aren't always going to rely on the same loadout, and one major way this is managed is by imposing ammunition limits which are more harsh than the previous games, especially since Snake can only hold a couple of weapons at most. During regular gameplay this feels well balanced, but it doesn't hold up as well when battle situations come along, and it took me a long time to adapt to the idea that supply markers were basically mandatory for some battles and boss fights. The various vehicles Snake goes up against are also tremendous bullet sponges, which doesn't help matters. It's not particularly enjoyable to spend 5 minutes repeating the same thing over and over to chip down a health bar. Going for a stealth approach has its pitfalls as well. Being seen once seems to ruin the whole mission, requiring a restart. Frustrating when it happens after taking out a dozen soldiers. I feel like these missions were built with co-op in mind, and they work really well for that mode, but that doesn't change the fact that single players will have to go through it solo. The true boss fights are the mechs, which I think are designed a lot better for single player. There's no guards during these fights, which means Snake can go in with 2 or 3 rocket launchers, helping to alleviate those ammo concerns. The first one is the Pupa, a giant tank that boosts around an arena. It's a pretty enjoyable boss, like a more action-orientated fight against a Shagohod. It's funny how the series seemed to have a steadily decreasing emphasis on mechs. MGS1 is practically defined by Metal Gear Rex. MGS2 had a Rex equivalent, but focused more on arsenal gear and an attempt to censor the internet. The Shagohod in MGS3 made for a great set piece, but the boss itself seemed like something of an afterthought, and never really captured the focus of the story. The climactic mech battle in MGS4 took place well before the end and used recycled Metal Gears. Enjoyable though it was, it also kind of showed how the series had moved on from being defined by those big metal beasts. Peace Walker is a complete reversal. Every boss is a mech this time around, and it's a change I welcome. I imagine it was done because of the difficulties establishing a strong series of enemy characters using the relatively limited amount of exposition through cutscenes, although maybe it was a simple case of having run out of ideas. The Beauty and the Beast unit were certainly uninspired since they recycled all the previous bosses, and besides them there were no new bosses established in MGS4. The series had become known for its unique and interesting boss fights, so the reliance on mechs in Peace Walker does remove some of the charm, but I think they make a nice change of pace from the other games, and they're a well-established element to the series, one which had been neglected a bit in the preceding games. Considering how many people let me know I was wrong about the floating platforms being ahead of their time in MGS3, I'm a little gun-shy about saying the same for the bosses of Peace Walker. I'm going to go out on a limb though and assume we didn't have sentient UFOs equipped with railguns back in the 1970s. This tech is obviously well ahead of its time, and although it's far more ludicrous than anything in MGS3, I actually have an easier time accepting it, perhaps because MGS3 prepared me for it somewhat. Mostly though I think this is because they're a core part of the story, whereas the floating platforms in MGS3 felt tacked on without a real purpose. After getting past the initial disappointment of realising these AIs would be the bosses for the whole game, I came to realise that they're actually pretty well designed. Each one has a unique feel to it. The Pupa is fast, the Chrysalis is the only one that flies, the Cocoon is slow but enormous, and Peace Walker is the typical Metal Gear. They do a good job of differentiating themselves from one another, especially since this is something MGS 1 through 3 didn't do a great job of, even though the team had years between each installment for fresh ideas. They're not perfect bosses though, sometimes their movements are a little cheap and their health bars can take excessively long to chip down. Coldman is the major antagonist for much of the game, and Huey, Odacon's father, explains Coldman's views on deterrence after the fight with the Pupa. Personally, I think it's a bit naive to assume that humans wouldn't be capable of retaliating in a Cold War situation for fear of wiping out the human race, but it is a possibility, a valid take on the situation. Having the antagonist's thought process spelled out early on like this makes for a great change compared to the murky waters of the other Metal Gear plots. Instead of anything complicated, the focus this time is once again on Snake's relationship with the boss. She gets reintroduced after a while in the form of an AI, constructed by a scientist called Strangelove from documents and personal experiences with her. I'm very torn about this direction for the plot, because it has some great ideas, but I also feel it tramples on the events of MGS3. As I've said before, the ending to MGS3 is probably the most powerful moment the series has ever produced, and Kojima seems to know it. He may not have wanted to work on MGS3 in the first place, but I think after it was completed he recognised how well that scene worked and how positively people responded to it. It's good for any creator to know what works and what doesn't, but it started to get abused pretty early on. For example, the box art for Subsistence included Snake saluting on the cover. It makes for a great image, but I'm not sure it needed to be given so much exposure. It popped up again at the end of MGS4, and Peace Walker includes lots of flashbacks to the ending of MGS3. In MGS2 and 4, Kojima seemed more than willing to poke fans for their reverence of MGS1 and Shadow Moses. Perhaps somebody needs to do the same for him when it comes to the boss. Although I feel like Kojima is taking a powerful moment and running it into the ground, I have to admit the possibilities here are tantalizing. Forcing Snake to come face to face with a replica of the boss is an interesting turn of events, even if it is a bit contrived. I think Kojima is decent at coming up with intriguing plot turns, but his ability to take advantage of them is a bit less honed. If you ask me, Peace Walker should have focused more on Snake coming to terms with the boss's death, and initially it seemed to be going that direction, but it kind of derails itself as it goes along. It treats the Peace Walker AI as though it actually is the boss most of the time, and the ending focuses on the robot's decision to drown itself. The events at the end are so strange they may even be hinting that the boss's soul was actually inside the AI or something along those lines. Instead, I think it should have been treated as nothing more than a reflection of the boss that forces Snake to overcome his demons. There are a few small instances where the game succeeds in this regard, giving us a glimpse at Snake's feelings about the events. It's great to see him struggle to tell Strangelove the fake story about what happened. It was implied at the end of MGS3 that this was something Snake would have to do for the rest of his life, so it's only logical we would get to see what sort of impact that might have on him. There's also several points where he reacts with silence when others call him boss, since he prefers his old codename. One interesting moment for Snake and the player comes at the end when Peace Walker is crippled and needs to be destroyed. Firing rockets at it while it hemorrhages oil feels sort of like beating the boss to death, which is what I think Kojima was going for. In some ways this is the climax of the game, and it's a clever way to evoke some very grim emotions without resorting to any actual violence. Perhaps the best way the game capitalizes on its setup is with the scene where Strangelove demands to know the truth, but Snake sticks to his story even when he's tortured. If you ask me, this is one of the best scenes in the game because it shows Snake's devotion to the boss persists despite the physical and emotional pain he's put through. Hilariously, the Japanese version of this scene was censored, with the stun baton instead being a laughing rod that tickled Snake into submission. Just imagine David Hayter getting a fit of the giggles while the scene plays out and you've got the idea. Strangelove and her relationship with the boss is a questionable inclusion, especially since it seems to hint Strangelove may have been romantically interested in her and the boss may have even reciprocated. An unexpected turn of events, but not one which really adds to anything. Strangelove talks about the boss at length, and I think the problem with this is how it demystifies her. MGS3 gave just enough details about her life to give her depth, but also put some distance between her and Snake. She still retains a sort of legendary status in that game. The more we hear about her personal life, the less of a legend she becomes, which is both a good and a bad thing. It's been a core element to the series so far that there always seems to be some kind of mentor for the player character who is untouchably brilliant. Big Boss was established as the greatest soldier ever when we were playing as Solid Snake. Solid Snake was presented as an enormously heroic figure when we were playing as Raiden. When we finally got the chance to play as Big Boss, the curtain rolled back and revealed a soldier even more capable than him. Kojima has hinted that they would like to make a game even further back in the timeline starring the boss as the player's character, but I don't think that would be a good decision. The chain of events has to start somewhere, and it may as well start with the boss. Once a player steps into her shoes, then she'll no longer be a powerful figure. More details about the boss have a chance to make her a better fleshed out character than before, but will also make her a less interesting symbol than before. Peace Walker doesn't really fail in this regard, but it does start to tip in the wrong direction a little bit. The boss is the pillar upon which the whole of Metal Gear Solid is balanced. If she falls over, then the entire narrative of the series goes with her. Peace Walker's central theme of peace doesn't really tie into the larger Metal Gear theme of identity, but that idea was already being stretched thin, and Peace Walker still slots in very well with the other games regardless. I'm not fond of the focus on the boss's AI, but even so it pulls off the sense theme better than MGS4 was able to. Snake and Strangelove spend the whole game wondering what the boss's thought processes were, and in the end they get some idea of what she wanted for the world, but they can never truly be sure. It's also a fateful turn of events for Big Boss, as the AI causes him to feel as though the boss turned her back on him and their entire lifestyle, which he probably only embraced because of her in the first place. He accepts his codename and starts out on the path that will lead him to being the antagonist of Solid Snake later on. This kicks off what I'd call the second phase of Peace Walker. Even though the story is ostensibly done at this point, the player is allowed to continue on and teased with an extra hidden chapter. This capitalizes on the mission-based structure and all the optional content. There's also no explicit direction for the player to take, which is basically a first in the series. It's a transitional moment where Big Boss is truly becoming the kind of leader he would be for the next couple of decades. This increased trust in the player to just do whatever they want works nicely as a mirror to Big Boss and his freedom as MSF becomes a force to be reckoned with. You could say Peace Walker really begins here with most of the content unlocked and a wealth of extra missions to be discovered. There's not much story to push the player along, but thankfully there's plenty of other factors that keep people going. Constructing Metal Gear Zeke, improving Mother Base, completing optional missions, and partaking in multiplayer are all the driving force for this epilogue of sorts. I can see how some players might fizzle out here and never see the true ending, but if you ask me, it's about time a Metal Gear game trusted its gameplay to push players along for a change. There's only so much that can be said about the gameplay in Peace Walker, but to be honest, that's kind of a good thing. On a basic level, it was questionably designed in the first place, since it took a third-person camera control scheme, obviously designed for 2 analog sticks, and applied it to a machine that only had 1. Apart from this problem, which admittedly isn't a problem anymore thanks to the re-release, Peace Walker is about as good as anyone could expect from a Metal Gear game, especially one released on a handheld system. In fact, I think the restrictions this placed on the team may have had a beneficial effect on the game's design. I feel like Kojima's games have always suffered from an emphasis on set pieces rather than the core gameplay. MGS3 was the exception to the rule, and it's one of the reasons why I love that game so much despite some heavy flaws. Peace Walker is the same, with the exception of the boss fights, it's stealth gameplay all the way down. Probably just because the platform itself wouldn't allow for the sort of flashy stuff Kojima likes to clog his games with. On the flip side, one limitation which was disappointing for me but ultimately understandable is how lifeless the environment feels. Those little touches from the previous games were sacrificed in the move to the PSP. There's no animals skittering about, and the Easter eggs are less well integrated into the game. Instead, there's a heavy emphasis on unlockables. These can be fun, bizarre, or sometimes both at the same time. The way their inclusion is handled isn't as nice as simply discovering stuff as you play the game, but the sheer amount of extras makes up for it. There's a lot of content in Peace Walker, and it goes to show some of the benefits of the reduced emphasis on graphics compared to MGS4. The team that worked on Peace Walker was basically the same size as the MGS4 team, yet they've crafted a lot of different areas and optional missions in half the amount of time it took to make the previous game. Despite all this, the extra content does cheat sometimes, particularly once the main ops are completed and areas start being reused. The Zadornov missions are a particularly noteworthy example, and while I definitely would have prepared some new areas to go along with these, I still quite enjoyed them. Boss fights are also recycled, and the management side of things can sometimes require the player to grind out some missions in order to acquire resources or soldiers. The Metal Gear Zeke parts are particularly bad for this, since completing the AI components requires tons of parts from the various bosses. It's excessive, but I suppose since it's optional it's not really a detriment to most players. Adding in the multiplayer component, you've got the most content a Metal Gear game has ever offered, and thankfully it hasn't suffered in quality as a result. After playing enough of the game and completing certain requirements, the true ending can be triggered, which sees Paz take control of Metal Gear Zeke and present one final boss fight to the player. Forcing the player to fight the mech they spent time building is a great turn. The sequence itself is a bit strange though, particularly the decision to put Paz in her underwear. I understand this is because the cockpit floods with liquid, but I imagine this was engineered as a way to get her down to her panties rather than the other way around. When I started the boss fight not long later and a J-pop image song started playing, I couldn't help but feel that the wackiness had undermined this finale to the game a little bit. Don't get me wrong, I still really enjoyed the ending to Peace Walker, and the song did lend quite a sense of energy to the fight, but it was a bit too much at odds with how I feel the tone should have been at this moment. I've reflected on this quite a lot because I feel it might be some kind of strange bias on my part, so allow me to break down my feelings on it. Kojima is Japanese, so it's only natural for him to include some Japanese elements in his games, regardless of how strange those things might be to Western players due to lack of exposure. I'd say I'm not as acclimated to Japanese culture as a lot of people, but maybe more than most Peace Walker players. I'm often more interested in Japanese games than anything coming from the West, and I consume a disproportionate amount of media in general from Japan compared to other countries. Despite this, I still found the Paz song to be quite a strange choice for this mission. Perhaps this is one of the main reasons why MGS3 has been my favourite in the series. It had the fewest Japanese elements in it. Metal Gear Solid has always been a smash of very Western ideas with a few more Japanese ones thrown in, and to an extent it works, mostly by lending the series a sense of uniqueness. Metal Gear is more interesting with cyborg ninjas than without, but sometimes it gets out of hand and starts feeling like one of my Japanese animes a bit too much. As much as part of me hates to admit it, I found the song to be pretty damn catchy, and if Peace Walker dealt with different subject matter, this may have been a great final boss theme. This is Big Boss we're talking about though. He's a gruff, American soldier haunted by his past and hunted by everyone. He's fighting a nuclear tank which is ready to bomb the United States and bring about World War III. I can't accept that J-pop was the right music choice here. Music is perhaps the most subjective part of any game, so forgive me if we disagree here, but as far as soundtrack choices go, I don't think any of the major songs from the series have ever topped The Best Is Yet To Come from MGS1. There are two main reasons why I think it's the best one. Firstly, it's a much lower tempo than any of the other major songs in the series, which helps it fit tonally for the point where it plays. And secondly, it's sung in Irish, meaning very few people understand it when they hear it. It's as alien to Kojima as it is to everyone else. We're insulated from the inherent cheese factor the lyrics in the other songs have provided because the Irish acts as a buffer. If you haven't bothered to go look up the lyrics, then The Best Is Yet To Come is about whatever you want it to be about in that moment when you finish MGS1. Snake is free, and as he rides off into the sunset, the song punctuates this fact. Beyond that, it doesn't really matter what it's about. You can't say the same for the other songs because they're done in English. In this way, I'd argue Paz's song actually had an advantage, but still managed to blow it because of how little the music matched the scene. The fight with Zeke itself is about as good as any of the other mech fights in the game. It perhaps doesn't do enough to differentiate itself from Peace Walker, but it's a more than satisfying final battle. The conclusion to the story is satisfying as well, showing that transformation in Big Boss that was sorely needed by this point in the timeline. It's nice to see the events between him and Zero get fleshed out a bit, with the hint of more to come. The gaps in the series have been a problem, and as I said in the MGS4 video, the damage has already been done, so I'm not sure it can be repaired. Maybe someday, after a few more inevitable installments flesh out the timeline even further, the problem might be rectified somewhat. MGS4 will be a lot more satisfying to play under the condition the series is played in chronological order, but as it stands, the stuff between Big Boss and Zero is still too little, too late. To be fair, this is more a problem with MGS4 than it is with Peace Walker. Taken on its own, Peace Walker definitely succeeds. It tells a satisfying origin story for Big Boss as he finally overcomes the events of the Snake Eater mission and establishes himself as a burgeoning world power. The naturalistic way the development of Zeke and Mother Base is handled really helps the player to feel a part of this, strengthening the narrative a great deal. Big Boss's speech at the end is also one of the best monologues in a series which has produced quite a lot of those. In some ways, Peace Walker is the most interesting and unique Metal Gear Solid title to date. It should be acknowledged, however, that what it does manage to accomplish, it does so on the back of Portable Ops. Portable Ops was unfortunately a very flawed experience, but it laid a great groundwork for Peace Walker. While I can understand some people who want to ignore that game's existence, especially since it wasn't directed by Kojima, it at least deserves to be acknowledged as the backbone for this game. Whether Peace Walker is better or worse because it was made for a handheld device is entirely up for debate. The controls took a hit, but the local multiplayer was a joy. The graphics suffered, but the scale of the game increased as a result. For me, the focus on the stealth gameplay, unhampered by the slow capturing process that held back Portable Ops, is perhaps the best thing about Peace Walker. It helps that the game has a ton of additional content, which gives the player more to do without forcing it on them too much. If the player just wants to play sneaking missions as Snake constantly, then Peace Walker is happy to oblige. Despite feeling totally different and having totally different successes and failures, Peace Walker reminds me the most of MGS1 a lot of the time. It doesn't succeed at everything as often as MGS1 did, but it deserves credit for attempting far more as well. So that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes this series of reviews. If you watched this whole series, then I sincerely hope it was worth your time. I would like to say one more thing about Metal Gear as a whole though. I can only hope that Big Boss's speech at the end of Peace Walker about Outer Heaven being a soulless service for others who need them isn't one of those reflexive moments that mirrors Kojima's life. There's something about that speech that worries me, even though Kojima seems to have a particular fondness for the saga of Big Boss. I would say that fondness shone through in Peace Walker. It seems to me like the most fun Kojima has had making a Metal Gear game in a long time, but obviously I can't say for sure. I'm not a mind reader. If it is some kind of meta-commentary on Kojima's feelings towards his own studio, then maybe he should take a lesson from Big Boss's saga and skip straight to the end, rather than inflict another 25 years of this on himself. Despite a few failings, I can honestly say I've loved my time with the Metal Gear Solid series, and even though the cutscenes are always going to be a huge turn-off for a lot of people, I think it's a series with a lot to learn from when it comes to games development. It's a series that takes chances, focuses on details many other games ignore, and is driven and owned by a single man, Hideo Kojima. In spite of a few problems, Peace Walker was great and I want more games like it, but I'm not sure how much longer Kojima has it in him. He's obviously a creative person, and for every Metal Gear Solid game I play, I've generally come out the other side pleased with the experience, but also curious as to what could have been, what other games this man could have made instead. I look forward to the next Metal Gear Solid, but at the same time I also feel it's robbing me of something else. Maybe that's how Kojima feels as well.